Philadelphia, PJFM in conversation. So I want to introduce our guest. Emanuel Rotstein is a producer, a director. He is works for the German History Channel and was integral in this project, Seeing Light. And Mark Hancock is a historian and educator who's was in the class of the film you just saw and is now working on his PhD at Graz College in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I'm Elliot Ratzman, longtime Philadelphia Film Festival academic, and now the chair in Jewish Studies at Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana, but happy to be back. So thanks everybody for being here with us today. And I want to start with Emanuel. How did you get involved with this project? What inspired you to put it together? And how did you come to hear about this story?
Thank you, Elliot, for having me. Thank you, PJFM, for hosting this and showing the invisible line on your festival. Well, how did I hear about the story? The story of the wave is probably one of the most well-known stories or novels in Germany. It's compulsory reading. So every student in Germany knows about the wave story. But probably none of those students know that it's a real story and what were the real circumstances. Being the grandson of survivors, I was always, bothered by the question how it could have happened, how it could have happened in Germany. And also the question, what am I doing in Germany? So I was constantly looking for answers. And one of the puzzle pieces is, of course, the wave story. How could a classroom of normal American students be turned into blind followers? So I was always intrigued by the story. And a couple of years ago, I had the pleasure of meeting Mark Hancock and the initiator, Ron Jones, for a different project on dictatorships and why are people interested or lured in by dictators. And when I met those two gentlemen, I was so intrigued by their stories and how they felt 50 years after the experiment that I thought, okay, it's worthwhile doing a whole documentary about the wave story. And with Mark's help, it came to light.
So in what ways is this story, how should I put it, has it been, you said it's circulated in Germany, but has it been reproduced? That is, has any teacher tried to do a similar experiment in the, let's say, European context?
Not as far as I know. In the European context, especially in Germany, teachers are very hesitant or reluctant of reproducing an experiment like this. It was always seen as a warning for the students and how dangerous that could be if we would try something like that. I think the biggest difference is that kids were reading a novel, and it was a novelization or a fictionalization of the original story. And I always was intrigued by the real facts and by the real people. So I started to dig deeper.
Interesting. Mark, now you've been involved with sort of curating the legacy in some ways, the memory of this experiment. And so you've had an opportunity to talk to many different audiences in many different places. I was wondering if you could share perhaps any significant memories that stand out, moments of clarity, moments of confusion with audiences that have heard you speak about your experiences.
I've done a combination of speaking in schools where I'm talking to usually secondary students, occasionally universities, and then also attending film festivals over the years, and then theater productions, because there's a number of wave theater plays and wave musicals even. It's hard to imagine this as a musical, but there are some. And I think the thing that surprises me the most around all of this is the fact that this story pops up everywhere. Before the internet, we really didn't know much about it. It was in terms of the spread of it. We knew the 81 movie came out and the 81 book came out, but without the internet, we really had no sense of what was happening with it. And then in 95, when the World Wide Web kicked in, we started to see it online. And over the years, it's just spread like wildfire. And then, of course, as populism has spread in the last few years, it's spread even more. So what surprises me is I'm on a train in Germany and I'm talking to a woman next to me from India, and she says, I studied the wave when I grew up in India. And I went to a luncheon and did a presentation at the United Nations in New York several years ago. And a woman in the luncheon said, I grew up in Eritrea and I studied the wave in Eritrea. We've discovered the theater plays. I went to Delhi, India a few years ago and met a theater group that's repeatedly done a wave play there. We just recently found out that there's wave plays in Russia. I know it's been done at least once in China a few years ago. Probably the most fun is we get emails from kids all around the world saying, help me with my homework. That's really fun. And they're all over the world. And probably the most interesting one that comes to mind is a young woman in Colombia sent me a photograph of a wave cake that she had baked, and the icing on the cake was the wave. So you just never know where it's going to pop up, and that's probably the most fun. There's people who want to argue the story one way or another, and we'll talk about this. People take away what they want from the story, and it's a variety of different perspectives. But in an audience, you'll get some people supportive, and occasionally you'll get called out and challenged, and that makes it interesting as well. I think, but what surprises me the most is where it pops up. It's just amazing.
Now, you getting called out and challenged, that's intriguing. So what comes to mind when you remember such?
Well, there's three, and this is an awkward discussion for me, but there's three times when I've had interesting situations. I was in a writing class because I still want to write up my own perspective of what this experience was like on the receiving end. And this is early on, many years ago, and I glibly said, oh, we're all sharing what our stories are going to be, and I said, oh, I was in this history class and it's related to the Holocaust and so on and so on. And a guy down the table called me out and he said, Mark, that was a high school class of 15-year-olds in California. My family has real Holocaust history. You need to think about that. And he was right. And I had not really given it a lot of serious thought until then. And so I learned a lot from that discussion and that challenge. And he's right, totally right. A second one similar to that was I was in Victoria, Canada at a Holocaust Memorial Day. That it was a school, the University of Victoria was doing it for the local high schools. And we showed a wave film, and afterwards did Q&A. And an older man in the audience who may or may not have been a survivor, but he had a very rich accent, said, why are we listening to you today? This is all about the Holocaust. What do you have to do with any of this? And the same thing, this is a California thing in the 60s. And so the professor said, it's not, and I've always said this since, it's not what we did, it's that this enables these discussions. These are not easy topics, they're complicated and difficult, and our story, it basically is a way to open up and maybe expand discussions on the topic. And the most fun one was, we showed a wave film here in Seattle, and a friend of mine here in Seattle is a survivor, and so I was anxious. I got him tickets and was anxious to see what he thought about it. And so when it was over and we were doing the Q&A, he held his hand up in the audience and he stood up, and I'm all nervous. And, what do you think? What do you think? And he says, Mark, it's too long. The film is too long. So you just never know what's going to happen. So for some people, it's shouldn't be discussed at all. For some people, it's too long. Other people, they want to, it's very important. So I think the variety of responses is what makes it really interesting. And you go online and you'll find it left and right. You'll find people who back in Obama's days made YouTube videos with Obama and the wave alternating and trying to paint him in that corner. And then my favorite one, there's actually two of them. One is that there's a wonderful 10-minute Lego version of the wave on YouTube in German. And there's also a short 3-minute piece where a person took the wave soundtrack and put it to Harry Potter video. So that's a lot of fun. So you just never know what's going to happen to it. And that's every morning's an adventure when you open your email.
That's fascinating. It sounds like everybody's a critic. It's too long, it's too short, not authentic enough. Emanuel, I have a question for you on this theme. I mean, the film I think was really the right length, but there must have been stuff that you wanted to put in, parts of interviews that got left on the cutting room floor. Can you think of anything that you wish you could have squeezed in there if you had another 15 minutes?
It's a great question, and it's a question I've asked myself in the editing room. There were a lot of references to the previous American president, and how his handling of politics and his personality and all what he did to the democracy in America was part of the interviews, or was very much featured in the discussions we had with the former WAVE students, and I felt the need to leave it out at this point because I wanted to give the documentary a longer shelf life and not concentrate on the former administration. And I thought it was the right decision because it makes it much more relevant to other forms of challenges to our democratic systems, and not only the former president. So this was something I have left out, and maybe there's an opportunity where I can show it, because those statements were really interesting.
Yeah, so this leads me to a question about the learning, and I was wondering if anybody in that class, or who had experienced viscerally firsthand let's say the lore of authoritarianism, what happened in their lives politically afterwards? Did they all become committed individualists, libertarian, liberals? Did anyone drift into more, I don't want to say authoritarian, but maybe attracted to that sort of vibe? Any reflections on that?
I mean, I can speak from my perspective, speaking to a handful of students. I think Mark knows his former classmates better than I do. But my impression was that they were really hesitant to join any kind of organization or political party, or to be attracted by a certain political group. So they were really open-minded, being very, very hesitant to form an opinion and be very quick in their decision making. So yes, they were very critical of the former administration, but not to that point that they were on a far spectrum, or a far side of the political spectrum. I think this lesson has been learned. They are not used for a political cause anymore.
Within our class, there's most of them, of course, I've lost touch with, although every 10 years we have the high school reunions, and you never know who's going to show up. But we've had when in researching this story and our experiences, we've got a variety of responses from students. We have students who are anxious to talk about it. We have students who don't really want to talk about it. We have some that we've talked to and they said, good projects, but we don't want to be on camera. We have one at least who says they don't remember it. And we have to respect that, because maybe that week they were busy with something else that was more important in their lives. You just don't know. So, and since this was the 60s, I can't even tell you that this is the main thing that motivated me to what I'm doing now. But it's I've been able to use it as a focus now. But we're in Palo Alto in 1967, and the Vietnam War is raging. At that time, there's 1,000 soldiers a month dying in Vietnam. Friends and brothers and so on are being drafted. The boys in the class are just over 2 years from being drafted themselves. The war was not popular, especially in liberal Northern California at that time. And the week after the wave, 100,000 of us hit the streets of San Francisco in one of the biggest anti-war demonstrations in the country's history. There were 200,000 in New York the same weekend. My parents were very politically active. Very much so, and community oriented, lots of community groups as well as politics. And so, can I say the wave was the main thing for me personally? It was part of it, but there was plenty of other things going on. And for other students in the class, we have students who don't. Some students. Let me start over. On a Facebook posting a few years ago, there was a comment made underneath a wave discussion where somebody said, "Oh yeah, my cousin was in that class, and they were traumatically disturbed by it." We have no idea who it is. We don't know what their experience was, but and there is at least one or two students who are critical of the way it's discussed now. it was not the same experience for them. And so it just depends who you talk to. You really can't generalize about this group any more than any other group.
I remember in 1981, I watched that after school special based on the experiment, and I can still conjure the feelings at the end where the black and white reels of Nazi Germany and students crying in my memory in the film, and I can still remember that, and I think that set me down personally on a kind of my career thinking about the use of power. And to turn the question on the other side is, can one create structures of authority and charisma for the good? That is, if the experiments, obviously totalitarianism is bad, but can we think about using the same sort of levers of human nature to get people to do the good? And this is why I'm concerned, Emanuel, when you're saying that people are just turned off from politics altogether and saying, well, we don't want to join anything. Are there lessons from this experiment that could give us insight about how we get people to be upstanders for good causes?
I mean, for sure, you definitely have certain elements in sports, in music, in any kind of team, or where you have a cohesive group that has a certain goal or an aim they're looking for. You find those mechanisms in political parties. You find those mechanisms everywhere in work environments. So it can be used definitely for good purposes. But I think, as the name of the documentary says, the invisible line, as soon as you cross this line where you stop questioning, where humor is not allowed, where people are forced to speak with one voice, all this good evaporates and turns into evil, and you could have the best of intentions when individuality is given up for the purpose of a common goal. You are heading in an awful wrong direction. And when you look at dictatorships or authoritarian regimes around the world, they haven't started with bad intentions. They probably have all great ideas and wishes and intentions for their people, but in the end, that won't work if you have to give up your own freedom for the cause.
Yeah, Jim Jones, who actually grew up here where I'm at in Richmond, Indiana, in the People's Temple that made its way to Guyana, right, in Jonestown, started out as a very forward-thinking, interracial social justice community. And maybe this brings us back to what Ron Jones expressed in the documentary, that getting a taste of this power started to change him, and his wife commented on it throughout the film. So I'm wondering how we might be able to sort of draw lessons about putting stopgaps about the perverting power of charismatic authority. Have we thought about how that might be addressed from the lessons from the experiment?
Yes, definitely. I mean, when I'm talking to school classes or different groups after watching the film, I get this question: what are the warning signs, or where do we see that an organization or a group is heading in the wrong direction? And we can definitely see a certain pattern within organizations or within forms of government where you see, okay, this is getting dangerous. The first one is the lack of a variety of opinions. If opinions have to be all the same, okay, this is getting difficult. If there is a certain element of black and white, no shades of gray in the middle, if people start to offer you easy answers to very complicated questions, this is a definite warning sign, because the world is not easy. If you are looking for an enemy, a clear enemy outside your group, where all your anger and frustration is pointed at, or an enemy within your group where all your anger and frustration is pointed at, you will see, okay, this could be problematic. And there are so many signs, and I always say it's like the blueprint of dictatorship. So it's the blue book of dictators, and it seems to me they all have used the same sources in forming their organizations, from the far left to the far right. And Ron Jones does it as well. He gets rid of the elites, the students who ask the critical question. They are sent to the library. This is the worst form of punishment, and you've seen it all over history. The first ones are the elites who are attacked. They're sent to prison. They are punished for their opinions. They're punished for the intelligentsia was driven out of the countries, and then you can do everything with the rest of the population.
I think Emanuel hit on a really important one, and that's the warning signs. Fascism is not sudden. Fascism happens over time, and there are warning signs. It's a gradual process, or extremism, fascism, extremism, either one. And so you've really got to pay attention during those earlier phases. Even our class, people say, "I can't believe it happened so fast." Well, it actually didn't happen that fast. We had him for 6 months. We trusted him. We knew him. And in today's terms, you would say he groomed us, but not, he didn't. This wasn't his original plan, but we had done experiments before. They were fun and harmless. We knew him. We trusted him. The pieces of the puzzle were put together as it came into being. And then he linked it to the Vietnam War, which really hit a line of energy within the students. And so we didn't just wake up one morning and say, "Oh, he's charismatic, we love him, and we're blind." We had self-interest involved, and he was telling us what we wanted to hear.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And now after this, after the experiment, he's let go. It wasn't quite clarified at the end of the documentary, but he was fired. Was he immediately fired, Mark? You were.
It's a little complicated, but the bottom line is he had a 3-year contract with the school district. We were that first year, which means that when we were seniors was his 3rd year. And so they decided not to retain him. He was controversial in the school. He was bold enough to take on the student interest groups that were political and back in those days, pretty radically left wing. And so he was the faculty advisor. That got him in trouble. He would bring in controversial speakers. He was one of those fun teachers who brings in speakers and movies, and it's a very interactive class, and that would get him in trouble if he brought the wrong speakers in and somebody was offended. And he was a young teacher. He was 26 years old, and all the other teachers were older and established. So he was disturbing the establishment in a variety of ways. The school and the school board said, "We're not going to keep you." Though the other key reason I have to mention is that if they would have renewed his contract, he would have had tenure. And so they didn't want to give him tenure. So they went back and forth. The students, out of a school of 1,200, nearly 800 students signed a petition asking to keep him. And these are kids from the left and the right, because he was always, as a teacher, neutral. He would say, "Here's the information, you form your own opinions." And we all respected him for that. We had, being the 60s, we had demonstrations. We marched, we occupied the school buildings, went to the school board and raised a fuss. Parents were involved in that as well, trying to keep him, and it didn't work. And ultimately, the school board said, "Well, we'll give you 1 year. You can start over at a different high school with a 1-year contract." And he said, "No, thank you." So, and then he spent 30 years working in a school, a facility for disabled people in San Francisco, which was a wonderful experience for everybody. But it was a difficult ending at our school for him.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And of course, we who are watching this recounting of this experiment happening might also bring to mind some of the more recent and I think less sophisticated attempts to create experiential education, which ends up backfiring. So
yeah,
I don't want to, it might be apples and oranges, but we've been hearing over the last few years attempts to role play slavery, for example, in a high school classroom that backfires terribly and poorly thought through, will not be something that will be edifying for generations to come, like the third wave experiment. But I'm wondering where this role of experiential education now takes us. I didn't go through this experiment, although interestingly enough, in a Jewish youth group retreat, we did do a role play in which we were forced to pretend to be prisoners in a camp, and our friends were the guards. And I remember just 20 minutes of that role playing. I can still conjure the feelings of anger and helplessness, perhaps the beginnings of helplessness. But I'm wondering where this future of this sort of experiential education lies when we're dealing with such controversial dynamics and moments.
So I'm 14 classes into my PhD program at Gratz College in Holocaust classes, and I can assure you that whether it's Yad Vashem or it's the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., quote unquote best practices are do not do experiments in Holocaust history classes. And the reasons are that number one, your classroom is supposed to be a safe space for your students. Your teacher's supposed to be your friend. If you do experiments like this, there are always perpetrators and victims. And what you're basically doing is you're sanctioning bullying in the classroom. And as you just said, and as I can speak from experience, you don't forget when you're bullied, even when somebody tells you it's a game. And the teacher's job is not to send kids home crying. It also trivializes the history because they think that whether it's your 20 minutes or my few days, you suddenly understand the issues and the topic, and which you don't. You get a taste of it, and that we got a taste, but we didn't get deep understanding. And ultimately, it trivializes the history, and then it disrespects the people who went through the real history. So for all those reasons, it's a best practice not to do it. But I can tell you that when I look at the social studies teachers national organizations, I do see simulations discussed in other topics like you just mentioned. So it's a controversial thing. A lot of people say don't do it. It's embarrassing for me to go into a classroom and say, listen to this, crazy experiment I was in, and then tell the teacher, please don't do this. So then back to your question, how do you give somebody an experience or an education that goes beyond reading a book and taking a test? And I will tell you that I'm pretty excited about the theater. Emanuel's film is really important because it's real people talking about a real experience as opposed to fiction. And then when you watch theater, when you watch people struggle through this story in theater, you come out of there feeling a little different than you did when you went in. And so to me, that's probably the middle ground for experiencing it is watch somebody else go through it. And if it's live on a stage in front of you, it'll have impact.
Yeah, that's fantastic. There's a lot of great insight. What we have, I mean, certainly my younger self had that fictionalized after school special in which the empathy was generated by the characters and the narrative brought into this. And Emanuel, this fine documentary just sort of deepens that. And I hope that does the same sort of work that the now dated but still interesting after school special does. I'm wondering if the third wave experiment also should be up there with the Zimbardo Stanford prison experiments. I know I always think of it in sort of a collection there, and the obedience to authority experiments from Yale. Mark, you and I were talking before this taping, and apparently the third wave experiment wasn't known to Zimbardo before did his Stanford prison experiments in 1971.
Correct. That's my understanding. Is because we happened in 67. I think, was he 73 or 71? He was early
71, I think.
And then our story wasn't known until our teacher wrote the short story that was published nationally in 1976. And before 76, nobody really knew about us. And then 76 led to the 81 movie because Hollywood found out about it. So there, and Zimbardo and our teacher have met a few times over the years, and I've been on stage with them as well. But back when Zimbardo did that, no, we weren't known. There was nothing in the local newspapers. It was a week in a high school class, and it came and went pretty quickly, and it was just before summer vacation, so we all moved on pretty fast. I went back and looked at the local papers, and the only things they covered were high school sports, and then maybe the occasional, mathematics or chess award in a competition somewhere.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And what a crazy coincidence that the proximity of.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, Mark, tell us a little bit about what you're working on with your dissertation at Graz College, and we should give a shout out to Graz.
Yep, definitely. I'm so excited because I at some point I would have begged Graz for the opportunity to show the film there, and thank you to all of you in Philadelphia for making that happen. It's a shame we can't all do this in person. So yeah, well, I've just about finished the PhD classes, and the school has suggested that I do the dissertation on the wave story and the impact it's had and the issues behind it, and so on. So that it'll give me a chance to do a deeper dive into the whole thing, and I'll be asking you a few questions before I finish it. So I'm honored to have that opportunity, and I think I can add to the story as a student in the class. There's always more to tell. It's a complicated story. Emanuel had to squeeze this whole story into 45 minutes or 50 minutes, and that's it was quite an achievement that he did that, and he did a fantastic job. And I'm really excited to have been part of that. That one of the most fun things about this project is I get to hang out with cool people, and who would have dreamed when I was 15 years old that I could hang out with a guy as cool as Emanuel from the channel in Germany. I mean, that's not going to happen. And so it's just amazing. But that's it. So I'm hoping to take a deeper dive and leave something useful behind when I get it done, that maybe teachers who have more than a few minutes for the story will find useful.
Emanuel, did you bring your interviewees to Europe, or did you go to see them in the US?
I saw them in the US, but I had the pleasure of bringing Mark and Ron Jones to Germany for the premiere. So yes, most of the stuff was shot in America, but Mark came to the super cool Germany. I take it as a compliment. Yes, it was such a great experience meeting the students, and what is so fascinating about talking to people who had such a strong experience even after 50 years. They manage to dive into their younger selves and re-experience what they saw and felt during the couple of days in 1967. That was so fascinating when I see the tears and their face expressions and how we managed to bring them back into those fateful days in Palo Alto.
Fantastic. Well, I'm so glad to have this opportunity to talk with you two. Is there anything else you want to share with our Philadelphia audience?
I think for me, people ask what are the basic lessons, and I think that I used to joke that I don't trust anybody and I don't join groups. I've refined that a little bit now, and I say that I'm cautious and I use critical thinking, and I think this is an important story for critical thinking to show that. I'm glad and honored that people find it useful to show kids how extremism can get started. I think that, to me, that's my focus, is how does this stuff get started? And so I find it useful for that. And I do think it's easy to talk about charismatic leaders and blind followers, but I think it's far more complicated than that. Some of those charismatic leaders aren't really that charismatic. They're kind of goofy, but they have a way of moving things along. And then the blind followers, I think, act in their own interests. And we have to take a closer look at what that means and how that works. Ultimately, though, when you see this stuff starting to happen, you got to speak up and you got to stand up. And in this case, it's a longer story, but I was a bystander in this class. I sat back and watched it and tried to figure out what I was going to do. And I figured each day I'd get a better understanding and figure out what was happening and how I'd respond. And next thing I know, I'm trapped in that rally room. And so that's what happens in the real world. If you're a bystander, you get caught up and it sweeps over you. And so that goes back to our basic message these days, is that democracy is fragile, and democracy we cannot take for granted, and we need to fight for it, or someone will take it away from us.
These are important words, important lessons. Emanuel, we look so much forward to your next project, so hopefully we can help circulate them in the US as well. And thank you so much for the gift of your documentary. This will line. Mark, we look forward to your dissertation defense. Perhaps you'll come out to Philadelphia and we can have a big celebration for that.
I'd love that. I'd love that.
And Emanuel, of course, you're welcome back to Philly to any time to join us, hopefully in our post-COVID scene.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you again for including the film in the project. We really appreciate that.